Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily, reporting from the magazine that helps global leaders stay ahead, with insight on the people, companies, and trends shaping today's complex economy, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. The Bloomberg Businessweek Daily podcast with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
We are hearing from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He spoke to reporters, but didn't say much. He said that Greer and Lutnick will continue as needed. That's Jameson Greer, the USTR, and Howard Lutnick, of course, the Commerce Secretary. This in regard to the negotiations between the U.S. and China.
We know it's not easy, and we know these negotiations, as we said, especially when it comes to U.S.-China, the two biggest economies in the world, complicated relationship, and so there's a lot to be still done and to be known. So we're going to watch for some headlines. In the meantime, we've also been focusing on another trade relationship, and that has to do with U.S. and Mexico. We did moments ago get headlines. The U.S. and Mexico are close to a deal that would remove President Trump's 50% tariffs on steel imports up to a certain volume. That's similar to a deal during the president's first term. So kind of sounds like going full circle there. So let's see what our own Joe Doe has to say about this. Understands the steel industry like no other. He is Bloomberg News economic statecraft reporter. He is in Washington. Joe, so good to be checking in with you. I don't know. Tim and I have been talking about a lot of context here with the Cisco team, especially those who've been around for a long time. Give us some context on this deal against, what we have seen in the first Trump administration and what we've seen between this relationship generally when it comes to steel.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the context is what we're getting here is very similar to something we saw in the first term. During the first term, there were 25% tariffs on steel imports coming from everywhere in the world. But Mexico and Canada in particular were upset by this because they were the close trading partners. And you might remember in 2019, they were trying to create a new NAFTA. And as a part of getting the new NAFTA agreed, the United States agreed with Mexico that they would lift the 25% tariffs in exchange for an agreement that Mexico would stop imports of exceeding a certain level, like a historical level. Well, that's what we're seeing again here. They're getting close to finalizing terms between Mexico and the United States right now to lift that 50% tariff in exchange for Mexico agreeing that they won't import more than a certain level. One of the things we're hearing, though, is that level that they're not supposed to exceed is actually going to be higher than what the 2019 number was. So that's a real key point here.
What is the U.S.? Do we know what the U.S. is doing in response, or how the U.S. is getting Mexico to agree to a deal such as this?
I mean, one of the things that they're putting out there is just listen, okay, we're going to take this off, but we're going to have you agree essentially to a quota, right? And that essentially puts the level of imports that can come into the United States. And I think that's really the trade-off here. So yes, we'll lift the tariff, but hey, you can't go above historical numbers that we've been seeing out of Mexico into the United States over a certain period.
We saw investor response to this, Joe, in late trading after your reporting. Cleveland Cliffs dropped more than 7%. Nucor fell more than 4%. U.S. steel stocks overall declined. The peso trimmed losses after you and the team were the first to report on the advanced deal talks. What are the implications for American steel companies?
Yeah, I think the American steel companies wouldn't be too happy about this one. I mean, obviously, lifting of the tariff is one thing, but increasing that import level, that so-called quota, if you will, it's not actually a quota, it's just an agreed upon level. That, I think, is going to be something that's very striking to executives across the various steelmaker companies right now, because if you were expecting at some point maybe the tariff will be lifted, you might have been expecting that the quota, the threshold, would still be at that 2019 level. That's something you've seen over the past 6 years. So that idea that might come up, I think that's a bit of what we're seeing in the reaction of Cleveland Cliffs and Nucor Corporation and after-hours trading today.
All right. So, Joe, I feel like my head is spinning with tariffs.
Imagine how Joe feels.
Well, this is why we lean on you. So, step forward. This is good. Like, I don't know. It's obviously not for some of the U.S. steel players as we're seeing their share price go lower, but I'm trying to kind of, I don't know. Resolution is always good, but it depends on what you
listen,
get resolved.
Here's how I'd break it down. seemingly a net positive for Mexico. And listen, Howard Lutnick, who is leading the negotiations on this deal, could end up having a deal that he can take back to the president of the United States, right? I mean, one of the things is the president wants deals, and this is one he'd be able to take back to him. Sure, maybe the steelmakers won't be too happy about this, but there's another way of looking at it. Listen, Mexico hasn't had tariffs for a number of years. They got slapped back on when the president said he'd be putting tariffs back on Canada and Mexico back in February. So in a way, we're kind of reverting back to the way things have gone, basically for the past 4 to 6 years.
Do we call that a 180? Do we call that a 360? What do we call that?
I think people in the market who actually trade these things would say, oh, cool, so we're going back to the status quo. But again, we have to wait and see. The terms are still being finalized. I think that is a very important to be sure. The president of the United States has not been negotiating this directly, and he is ultimately the last person who has to sign off on it. So we do have to wait and see.
Joe Doe, Bloomberg News economic statecraft reporter, joining us from Washington once again. Joe and Eric Martin were first to report on the advanced deal talks as U.S. and Mexico are nearing a deal to cut steel duties and cap imports. We did see U.S. steel stocks decline and the peso trim losses after Joe and Eric's reporting.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily Podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
Happening just north of us in Los Angeles, the Trump administration escalated its response to anti-deportation protests in L.A. Marines deployed by President Trump arrived in the Los Angeles area with orders to protect federal property and officers as the city is gripped by tensions over anti-deportation protests. With an update, we go back to Los Angeles, where we find Sarah McGregor, national team managing editor for Bloomberg News. She joins us from our Los Angeles bureau. Sarah, we spoke to you yesterday, and I think a lot of our listeners and viewers heard that conversation. And I guess I want to start with an update on, obviously, we know what the Trump administration has done, what's happening on the ground when it comes to law enforcement. But what about what's happening on the ground when it comes to demonstrations, when it comes to protests? What is the status of those right now?
So we did see some violence, some sort of flare-ups, I guess, around the city overnight, including actually in other cities across the U.S. But, again, we woke up in the morning and the protesters or vandals had sort of dissipated. We did hear a figure that over 90 people have been arrested overnight, so there was some police action on that front. But again, the city's sort of calm as we wake up in the morning. And so it's definitely a contrast as we hear that the Marines have arrived. We don't know exactly where they're stationed yet. According to Karen Bass, the mayor, she also doesn't know. She's not in touch with the Trump administration, nor is the LAPD chief about where those Marines will be deployed. But it's a bit of a split screen that we're still seeing in terms of, the calm on the streets relative this morning compared to sort of the heavy hand of the law that's come down from the Trump administration with the Marines and the California National Guard on the streets.
So well said. Sarah, I was listening to some of your coverage earlier today, and you said, in terms of the Bloomberg office in Los Angeles, it's not like there's anything happening necessarily around you, right? I mean, you would think if you hadn't read the news, watched the news, you'd think it was a normal day.
Absolutely. Sort of across the city, I think, there are large areas where this is not affecting people. But of course, we are still hearing reports. Just now I was reading about one on social media that said at a food processing center in the state, there's apparently a raid going on. We've heard that at least 20 people who wash cars have been arrested. So there's these raids going on that we're not getting that much information about who's being targeted, how many people are being detained by ICE. And again, these were the raids that happened on Friday that really sparked these protests to begin with. So it just feels like a very tenuous situation right now where these raids are ongoing. We do have troops on the ground. And, we heard from Karen Bass that she is not coordinating with the Trump administration. So how much, information is flowing between local law enforcement and, the federal officials? And hopefully there isn't a breakdown of communication there that, leads to a sticky situation either.
A lot of our conversation yesterday focused on Governor Gavin Newsom of the state of California and his relationship or lack thereof with the Trump administration. You mentioned we don't know the coordination that's happening between the mayor of Los Angeles and the Trump administration. What's the latest when it comes to Governor Newsom and the Trump administration?
We did see a bizarre sort of exchange today where Trump told reporters in the Oval Office that he had spoken to Newsom yesterday. And within minutes, Newsom had tweeted that he hadn't spoken to Trump, nor had he even gotten as much as a voicemail. So, and Karen Bass, the mayor, has said she has not spoken directly to Trump. I don't think she's tried to reach out, but she hasn't spoken to them. So there's sort of this confusion, I think, even at the official level, too, of I guess the politics behind it. And, I guess everyone hoping that cooler heads will prevail and that everyone will be able to come up with a solution.
Last thought, I don't know, how are you guys thinking about kind of what happens next? Because it doesn't sound like there's a lot of communication between the government and certainly officials, the mayor, but who knows? I'm just curious, what insight are you getting between your sources or from your sources when it comes to the communication that you're seeing? What is, again, we keep reminding everybody, feels like a struggle between federal versus state.
Absolutely. This has been a really unpredictable situation. So I think what we do know is that the city has said, if the unrest grows, and they didn't say whether it's as early as tonight or down the road, they'd be willing to put a curfew in or take more aggressive measures. So I think that's what we're watching out for right now, whether the troops get involved or it just remains LAPD, Sheriff's Office, local forces. Where does this end? Do protesters keep coming out? Do they grow in size? Does it get out of hand or feel out of control at any point? And I think everyone's sort of on the edge of their seat waiting to see what happens next. And a lot of this action has been happening at night. So I think as the sun falls, that's when we start to see, people come out.
Right.
More on the protest sort of vandal side of things. So we're sort of waiting to see tonight what happens next.
All right, Sarah, as always, thanks again for the update. Sarah McGregor, our national team managing editor for Bloomberg News. She is there in our bureau in Los Angeles.
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We've got with us Jitu Patel. He's President and Chief Product Officer, and he's joining us here on site. Thank you for your patience. So much going on.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for being here. What do you think of this show?
It's pretty cool. It is way bigger than I thought it would be.
Yeah.
And we're just in one of the rooms here.
We're just in one of the rooms. It's hard to host 22,000 people in a single room, so we have to keep breaking it up.
Well,
this is big.
When you bring these people together, what is top of mind for you in terms of what you want to hear from them and what they are hoping to get from you?
Look, these are our customers, they're our partners, and they're companies who are considering buying Cisco technology. And one of the things that we want to make sure that we're very clear with is what are the core problems we're solving and what are the key innovations that we're making. And we want to make sure that we can provide that to them and have them talk to the technical experts so that they can actually learn about the products and, kind of pressure test them while they're here. We're in a really interesting place right now because we're in the next era of AI. So we've passed 2.5 years since ChatGPT came about. Carol, you and Tim know this. We had this kind of seismic shift that happened in the industry, and we had these chatbots that could intelligently answer questions that we had. Mm-hmm. And we're now going to this next era where there's going to be agents that can conduct tasks and jobs fully autonomously on our behalf. And they might work, initially they'll start working by themselves for a couple hours, and then over time there might be a couple of days, and then a couple of months, and a couple of quarters. And the possibility of the kinds of problems we can solve are so amazing. And we want to make sure that we provide the infrastructure to make that happen.
So are you talking about, with the agentic solutions that you're talking about, are you talking about inference specifically?
Correct. So we've been working on, working with people on making sure that we can provide the infrastructure for training for the past couple of years.
And that's where a lot of the
spend has been.
A lot of the spend, a lot of the rewarding by shareholders of certain companies, no question,
has been to date. But now what you're starting to see is the demand signal for inferencing is going up quite a bit. And if you think about what's happening in inferencing, when you just had an interactive mode where you would ask a chatbot a question, what would happen is you would have spikes of peaks that you would get on compute usage and on data center usage. When you have an agent, and that agent is fully autonomously and proactively working on something, and they're just kind of cranking away, and there's not just one agent, there's tens of agents working together, what you see is a sustained demand for inferencing capacity, and it's persistent inferencing that's needed. So your infrastructure kind of assumptions, the amount of network bandwidth you need, the amount of kind of safety and security that needs to be in play is very, very different. And so right now we're working with a lot of the governments who want to make sure that they have sovereign data centers all throughout the world.
Right.
We are also working with
that's a big demand push right now, isn't it?
huge demand push. I was in the Middle East just a couple of weeks ago, and we announced partnerships with Humane and Saudi Arabia. We announced partnerships with G42, with Stargate UAE. And the reason for this is because there's an insatiable demand right now. If you think about what's the constraint in AI today, it's infrastructure and it's safety and security, where people have to trust these systems, otherwise they're not going to use them. And so those are the two big constraints. And of course, the third one is a skills gap where you have to keep training people up. But the first two are pretty material. And imagine if we had a world where infrastructure was not a constraint. Imagine all the problems we could solve that we're currently not able to solve because of the constraint of infrastructure.
Well, but some of those constraints are serious, G2. And I think about,
Absolutely.
as you guys are ramping up and building out and providing what customers need, though, whether it's enough power to do it all. We just did a big story at Bloomberg last week about not enough engineers, workers for power plants and so on and so forth. So how are you guys kind of balancing that? You're doing what you need to be doing, but making sure everything else is there to support it.
I mean, if you think about the large constraints, they're compute, they're power, because GPUs are power hungry. And then there's network bandwidth, and then there's safety and security. Like, those are the four kind of high-level buckets. If you think about power, what we are trying to do is make sure that we can have the lowest amount of latency, the highest performance, and the most power efficiency, because how long it takes for a packet to get to the GPU to get processed really matters. And if you have idle time on a GPU, that's actually not a good thing. You want to make sure that you're keeping the GPU utilization high. Right. And so we need to make sure that we have power efficiency. Every kilowatt of power we save is a kilowatt of power you can give to the GPU, and then we need to make sure that the packets keep flowing. Well,
so forgive me. So capability and efficiency, you're constantly balancing.
Constantly balancing it.
Right? Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
Because you've got to make sure it's efficient. Otherwise, it's not going to be financially going to make sense.
That's exactly right. Because if you don't have the right level of power efficiency, firstly, all of the data centers that are getting built right now, we are running out of data centers to build in certain geographies because you don't have enough power. So you actually tend to go to where the power is. And data centers are getting built where the power is. So it's a very important commodity.
Is that true globally?
Yeah, it's absolutely.
Yeah.
You're starting to see,
running out of places to run data centers because of lack of power.
Yeah, you just need you need to be not too far from the power so that the entropy is less and how that whole thing works.
You're good, Carol.
I love the enthusiasm between the two of you, though.
I've got a whole list of questions that I want to make sure we get to.
We said we can go as long with G2 as you will give us.
Yes, that is
go as long as you want.
That is the answer. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship that you have with NVIDIA?
Yes.
Because I think a lot of investors are trying to understand from a customer perspective, from just a relationship perspective. What can you tell us?
So we have enjoyed a very meaningful partnership with them for the past 6 years. 6 years ago, we decided that we're going to use the NVIDIA chipsets in our video conferencing devices. And that made those devices very, kind of AI ready. And now what you see is a lot of kind of sophisticated AI capabilities are uploaded on the device itself, so that even if the device integrates with a third party like Microsoft Teams, they can benefit from the AI innovations that we've made. So that's been a great partnership. What we did in the past few months, though, is we have doubled down on the partnership with data centers. And so we had announced that we have a AI factory and secure AI factory, which is basically what NVIDIA has as a reference architecture, which is a suggested mode of how companies should think about building out their infrastructure. And for the very first time, they had a non-NVIDIA silicon provider that was actually part of that reference architecture, who was Cisco. And we were the first one of those that they actually incorporated into their architecture. Why is that important? Because customers look to NVIDIA to say, hey, what does your reference architecture look like? And now Cisco is part of that reference architecture. So that was the first thing. But what we've also done and what we announced today was our safety and security capabilities are pretty sophisticated. And we want to make sure that we actually tie that with NVIDIA's, kind of efforts around. If you're building a open source model and an application with the NeMo framework, we can now validate that model with Cisco. And so we aren't just helping with NVIDIA on building a secure AI factory with the infrastructure and a full stack, but we're also helping with how do you keep it secure and how do you keep it safe? And so, because one of the challenges that you have is if people don't trust their AI systems, they're not going to use them. And so we want to make sure that people are trusting them.
We're talking with Jeetu Patel, President and Chief Product Officer at Cisco. We're here at Cisco Live 2025. What's the productive conversation around? So much focus is on, especially when it comes to NVIDIA and their demand for chips, the hyperscalers, how much they are doing to get an idea of where we are in the AI race. But I'm also, you talk to you folks, and it's a lot of on-premise build out. So what's the
both actually?
Yeah, or both. Okay. So what's the mix in terms of how we see this continue to grow?
So I think the way that you will see this progress forward is there's 3 or 4 different models that'll be out there. Firstly, one of the very counterintuitive things is hyperscalers are going to grow very rapidly, private data centers are going to grow very rapidly, and neoclouds, which are actually AI specialists, are going to grow very rapidly, and so are service providers. So when there's, kind of a rising tide, all boats rise, and that's what's happening right now. Now, what is happening that's unique with, data sovereignty and with, kind of nationalistic behaviors that are kind of progressing from a geopolitical standpoint is there's more and more of an acceleration of demand of private data centers.
Yeah, we talked about this on-prem.
On-prem.
Yeah.
And specifically for inferencing. I think for training,
that's interesting.
People might go to the cloud. But
do you see that as being part of a government regulation, a sovereignty issue, or is it more on an individual company basis?
It's actually a combination of issues. It's, there's a sovereignty issue. There's also a data proximity issue. There might also be some companies who have enough scale where the scale itself might give them an advantage that they're like, hey, I don't need to go pay someone something. I might want to have some of the workloads on my own premise. And so it's a combination of multiple issues. But what you are seeing is there's this kind of upsurge of demand and acceleration. The good news for us is we help the largest of hyperscalers with intra-cluster communication, on the networking side. We are also working with neo cloud providers. And then we've had relationships with service providers for the past couple of decades. And now what you're starting to see is a resurgence of demand on the enterprise that we know really, really well. We've actually been working with enterprise data centers for the past 40 years. And now we are actually starting to see a massive resurgence because of AI inferencing demand. And the agentic workflows, when every company is starting to rethink their workflows, whether it be a healthcare company or a bank or a financial services or insurance company, every workflow is getting reimagined. Infrastructure is going to be built out everywhere, and we want to make sure that we are the common networking substrate and we are the common security and safety kind of provider across the board.
So G2, in an environment where we constantly are talking about an uncertain environment because there's stuff coming at us even today as we kind of continue to watch the negotiations between U.S. and Chinese officials over in London, how would you describe demand, the CapEx spend that you are seeing, whether it's the hyperscalers, whether it's those folks building their enterprise systems, like the different buckets that you play into?
The demand signal is stronger than ever. I've never seen anything stronger on the demand signal side, because you've got trillions of dollars that are going to be flowing in for these data center build out capacities. So the demand signal is very strong. It's actually also happening globally. So it's not just happening in the U.S. You're starting to see demand in the Middle East. You're starting to see it in Europe. You're going to start to see it in Asia. And one of the things that's important for America is we want to make sure that American technologies are being utilized in all these data center build-outs, because that's good for America and that's good for the world, frankly. And so, Cisco and NVIDIA and OpenAI and others and all of our partners, I think AMD, it's extremely important that we all work together to make sure that these kind of data center build-outs happen with our technology.
You're shocking me with the striking magnitude of these investments.
It's
where is money not being spent as a result? As budgets get reallocated toward infrastructure, what's not getting money?
I think what you'll find is in the short term, you actually have to take a certain amount of dollars from existing projects and move them towards AI. And almost every company is doing that. They're saying, I'm going to take 20% out from my existing projects, move them towards AI. Over time, what you find is AI will get so much productivity that those 20% of the projects will get rehydrated. Because if you think about, like, for example, we're one of the first partners with OpenAI on their Codex project, which is the autonomous software engineer. It's no longer where you just have an autocomplete where you can have an individual developer that gets productive. You can actually now tell an agent or a group of agents, go solve a really hard problem for me and come back to me in a couple of weeks. And we'll be able to actually have a world that we're living in relatively short, kind of time horizons, where it'll be able to solve that problem and come back to you. And you'll still have the human in the loop that'll be able to observe and they'll be able to do things. But imagine what that does for the constraint. We have 27,000 engineers. I've never felt more constrained in my life about the ideas I have compared to the resources I have to prosecute those ideas. And we will actually get to a point where we can unlock those ideas in a very different way.
What?
I was just going to say, we could go on forever with G2, but apparently his team is telling us that you have to go speak. There's like even a speaking engagement coming
going.
Up. Oh, he doesn't want to do it. He wants to hang out with us instead.
You guys are too fun.
Hey, we're going to get in trouble if we do that.
Well, I mean, I'm going to go.
You go.
I mean, we're just kind of blown away every day, like what we are learning about this and how it's impacting our world. I mean, I don't know, 6 months from now, a year from, like, how should we be thinking about how dramatically this will impact everything?
I think firstly, your imagination will be challenged quite a bit because humans have a very hard time thinking exponentially for a sustained period of time. And this curve is exponential. And when it's exponential, it's not happening in a single dimension. It's happening across multiple dimensions all at once. And so if you think about it 6 months or 12 months or 18 months from now, no longer are you just going to be thinking about this as a more efficient way for getting an answer, but you will have companions and sidekicks and a staff of people that are digital workers that can get a job done that you would have otherwise not had a time to do. And one important area to talk about is a lot of people worry about, is AI going to take my job? Mm-hmm. I actually worry more about people that use AI really well. There's a higher risk of them taking your job than AI taking your job.
Noted.
And the other piece that I also think about is if you actually have, there's no one that I know that comes home every day and says, you know what, I've gotten everything done on my checklist, right? And so the reality is when there's 80% of the work that we do probably doesn't get checked off because we don't have time to do it. Now AI agents will start doing that. And then the final category that's the most exciting is AI will be able to do things that we were not able to do because it'll have original insights that don't exist in the human corpus of knowledge. And that's the area of AI that I think is the most underhyped.
G2, we got to leave it there. Your crew is about to come on set and pull you away to go and do.
I just want you to know I have a companion and sidekick. Yes. But I'm ready for my AI companion and sidekick.
Thank you so much to both of you for having me.
President and Chief Product Officer at Cisco here at Cisco Live 2025.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily Podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
So let's get to one of our favorite guests, I got to say, when it comes to Cisco. She's come on Bloomberg many times. She's definitely familiar to our regular viewers and listeners. She's often traveling. She comes to New York, as we said, she stops by. But she's got this great vantage point on people and technology and how the workplace is changing and so much more. Fran Kasudas is back with us, Executive Vice President and Chief People, Policy, and Purpose Officer at Cisco. She's also on the board of ADP, and she joins us here in San Diego. How are you?
Good. How are you? It's great to see you here.
It's great to be here. I mean, we're just kind of blown away. And just, we're talking so much about AI, as you would imagine. Tell us a little bit more about what the conversations you are having around work. We just talked to G2 and just, there's concerns that AI is going to replace all the jobs. But as he made this point, it's those people who know how to use AI. Those are the people you're going to have to be worried about because they're going to be a lot more productive and have bigger roles in the workforce.
So it's really interesting. From a broader work perspective, there are stats right now that are being released that tell us We have a lot of work to do, but similar to G2, I see a tremendous amount of upside. So Gallup actually put out a survey recently, and they said that 70% of U.S. workers are not using AI on their jobs today. And they said that 50% do not feel prepared whatsoever for what is coming. And what I think that means from a company perspective is that we have to create these bottoms up and these top down motions to really ensure that people can start to experiment. Because what we've seen at Cisco is when people start to play with the technology, they create the use cases. They see some of the opportunities that are there. The other thing that's interesting is that I do believe we'll start to see more and more roles consolidate. And you'll see that the technology will support a lot of the work, but people will have a broader vantage point or a broader remit. Generally speaking, that's good for employees. And so I think from an employer perspective, we have an accountability to ensure that our people are ready and that they're experimenting today.
You know, I want to talk a little bit about where we are in the history of this technology.
Yeah.
Because you've been at Cisco for around 3 decades at this point. So if we think about where things were in 1995, it was like the dawn of the World Wide Web. A lot of people had dial-up. That was the access that they had. Cisco was a completely different business. You've consistently been at the company since then. Contextualize for us how big of a deal the AI era is.
It's so huge. So listen to this. So I started at Cisco in the contact center. I was answering first line questions for our customers that called in. That role doesn't exist anymore. That role has been replaced by AI. And what we know today is about 1.6 million of Cisco customer cases are now solved leveraging AI. And the satisfaction scores are incredibly high. What that means is that those people that were doing those frontline calls are now at the next level. They're handling the more complicated issues. What that also means is that if you're someone coming out of college like I was, that entry-level role doesn't exist. What that means is that we as companies have to create more of a bridge now from someone coming into the workforce to whatever that new entry-level role is. And I think there will always be entry-level roles. The other thing that I would say is the contact center in particular is one of your best examples of a use case that is just prevalent across industries. And the reason for that, knowledge management system, clarity around how calls are answered. It's something that is measured in every single way. And so our challenge now is how do you get unstructured work to behave like a contact center, if you will?
So I understand the difference between, and sort of the example that you gave about jobs and how that's evolved. But if you think about this in the context of outside of Cisco and the idea that the internet opened up these opportunities for so many businesses to be built, is the promise of AI, in your view, bigger than anything you've seen in your career? Or is it kind of the same as what you saw with fast browsing and connectivity in the 90s?
I think it's bigger because of the pace. And I think what we're going to see is an intersection of the technology and all of the roles. And what's unique now is that you actually have roles coming together in meaningful ways. You have the ability for us to scale even beyond what we did as we stepped into the internet era. And so I think it's much, much bigger.
I'm curious about the macro issues. You're always so gracious in kind of talking about the macro environment. And I'm just thinking about the U.S.-China talks that are going on right now, Fran. And obviously it involves things like rare earth minerals, technology. These are things that certainly play into your world. You know, how are you guys thinking about that? How to make sure that Cisco, whether it's their supply chains and so on and so forth, are where they need to be?
I think for all companies, but from a Cisco perspective, what we're always thinking about is what are the scenarios that we have to be thinking about in how our customers consume, how our employees work. To your point, some of the geopolitical issues that we are not in control of whatsoever. And I think for us, having good people on the ground that understand, running those scenarios so that we know how we're going to respond as a company, and then being clear with what we control. I think one of the best things that we can do is provide stability to our customer base. And so what that means is in an area like supply chain, we have to have that redundancy. so that we can pivot left or right as we need to. And we've done a lot of that over the last couple of decades.
You talk scenarios. This was an environment where we were having earnings where companies were saying could be this one or it could be this. So not so great, good. And I'm just curious, are there more scenarios that you have to plan for in this environment, more than usual, or not necessarily?
No, I think there are. I think you're responding to external pressures. I think the tariff question is a big one for many of our customers as well. I think you have this technology coming in that's changing everything. And so when we look at AI, what we're looking at is how does it intersect our portfolio? How does it intersect the way in which we work? And then how does it intersect the way in which our people are working? And so you have all of these dynamics inside and outside of the company that come together. And something that I believe very strongly, and this is different from 3 decades ago, is that you don't have an outside of the company and inside of the company. Everything is blurred and you have to respond.
We haven't spoken to you in a few months, and I wanted to get an update from you on the way that you think about DEI, the way you think about ESG. This is all under your purview at Cisco. DEI has, I think it's fair to say, for this administration, it's turned into essentially a swear word. And it's something that they're rooting out of the federal government and trying to root out of private companies as well. Has your approach at Cisco changed at all?
So at Cisco, our purpose is to power an inclusive future for all. And that has really shaped us. It's guided us. It helps us to understand the way in which we show up to external communities, which is this element of how do we use our technology to include all? How do we ensure that we can drive a level of accessibility and connection? That part of our purpose absolutely stays true.
Nothing changes despite everything going on.
From a purpose perspective and how we show up to communities, we're showing up in the same way. And I think everyone understands that the more that you can help people connect via technology, they get access to education, healthcare. I think, Carol, that part of it is well understood. I think as a company and as we look at our internal practices, the first thing that I would say is you have to comply, of course, with any administration. And that's within the U.S. and outside of the U.S. as well. And so that's something that we're accustomed to doing. What I would say that's different, Tim, is that we take programs that at one point were a little bit more custom to a particular group, and we've opened them up to the entire company. And what we realize is there's a lot of goodness in those programs, and we want everyone to have opportunity and to be successful. And so that's the approach that we've taken.
That's really interesting. So, potentially, so it sounds like the things that you've done, you've actually made it more inclusive.
Yeah, we have. And I think it's a good moment to really assess what's working, what isn't working. And we've done that, and some of these programs are amazing, and so why not make them more available?
Is it fair to say that employees, your employee base, you guys are massive, like that they want some of these DEI initiatives, that they do? And
I think there's two things going on. Our employees and candidates that are looking at Cisco want to believe that we have a set of values that are aligned to theirs. And we see that all the time in the interview process. People have read our purpose report. They know what we stand for. I would say from an employee perspective, they want to know that we still care and that we're still driving a level of inclusion and belonging. And I think we absolutely are.
One last question. I've met some of the senior executive women at Cisco, and it seems like you guys really prioritize that. I look at yourself and others. But we continue to have, I think we've had this conversation with you, why aren't there still more senior women in C-suite positions or C-level positions more broadly? Why is it still such a struggle?
I think that for many companies, I think we do a really good job of bringing people in from university. And then I think there's a point where we lose women. At Cisco, we see great representation at the executive level and at the incoming levels. And so we have to continue to push through every element. But what we see and what the research tells us is that people want to see role models. And they want to be able to look and see someone that tells them, hey, if you're in this role, that means that I can be too. And so I think we have to continue to work on things like role modeling. I think we have to work on mentorship for all employees, sponsorship. All of these things, I think, create a better environment and provide career goals and pathways as well.
You got to be active about it, right?
That's right.
No doubt about it. Well, you are definitely a role model.
Thank you.
Great to check in with you again. Fran Kasudas, Executive Vice President and Chief People, Policy, and Purpose Officer at Cisco, joining us here at Cisco Live 2025.
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily Podcast. Available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.